In 1632, when Maryland was legally written into existence, the charter laid out its boundaries as being from the fountain of the River Potomac to the 40th degree of north latitude from the equinoctial, where New England is terminated. That means it should have looked like this, but we know it doesn't. Instead, it looks like this. What happened to all that territory? First, Maryland lost Delaware. Whether it ever really had it is up for debate. The Dutch and Swedish had been competing for territory along the Delaware River for years, completely unchallenged by the Marylanders, even though the charter claimed the land belonged to them. The Dutch succeeded in driving the Swedish out, and were able to add the Delaware River area to their growing list of successful trade locations. But that's all it was. Unlike the English, the Dutch and Swedes were not much interested in colonizing. Rather than families, servants, and sponsors, they erected fortified trading posts and occupied them with soldiers and commerce men. So in 1664, when the Duke of York, brother to King Charles II, decided it was time to get rid of the Dutch, he met little resistance. New Amsterdam's economically minded population peacefully ceded most of their territory to the English crown in exchange for the ability to carry on their business. New Amsterdam became New York, and Fort Casimir on the Delaware River, which had initially been Dutch, then Swedish, then Dutch again, became Newcastle when it was renamed by English powers. The Dutch were able to successfully retake the area in 1673, though managed to hold it for only a year, when it was again conquered by the English, this time permanently. At that point, most of the area we know as Delaware belonged, on paper, to Maryland, but the Duke of York was reasonably claiming it for himself, as he had gone through all the trouble of having it conquered, twice. Still, for the next 7 years, Maryland experienced the only bit of territorial stability it would have for its first 150 years of existence. That stability ended in 1681, when William Penn was granted a charter for Pennsylvania. The charter laid out an attempt at exact definitions for the colony's boundaries, but a lack of understanding of the actual geography proved extremely troublesome. The 43rd line of latitude was said to make its northern boundary. The Delaware River here was said to make its eastern boundary, and it was to continue west 5 degrees longitude to here for its western boundary. But it was the southern boundary which proved so contentious with Maryland. The charter asked that the southern begin at a place 12 miles north of Newcastle town, or at the beginning of the 40th degree latitude, whichever came first. But there was a problem. Newcastle wasn't anywhere close to the 40th degree. It was much farther south. The fact that Newcastle belonged legally to both Maryland and New York at the time proved to be no issue for William Penn at all. In 1682, his good friend, the Duke of York, awarded him the deed to what Pennsylvania began to call the 3 lower counties, Delaware. This granted Penn an access to the Atlantic Ocean that he desired for trade, but still denied him access to the Chesapeake. Or did it? The charter claimed his southern border would be a spot 12 miles north of Newcastle, or wherever that line intersected the 40th parallel, and that it would extend west along a straight line to the western border. But Newcastle's position put that 12-mile mark much farther south than the charter seems to have intended. Not surprisingly, Penn decided to read his charter in a way that granted him more land. Calvert, or Lord Baltimore, the proprietor of Maryland, insisted that Pennsylvania's southern border should be no farther south than the 40th parallel. The conflict over the area was mostly legal and theoretical in the 17th century. In 1685, King James, formerly the Duke of York, and still a friend to the Penn family, issued a ruling for a compromise. He drew a line west from Cape Henlopen halfway into the peninsula, and then a line straight down from the 40th parallel. He kept the northern border of Maryland at the 40th parallel, but there was a big problem. King James didn't actually know where Cape Henlopen was. In fact, it seems almost as if no one did. The map they drew started at Cape Fenwick, some 20 miles south of Cape Henlopen. By another unlucky accident, Maryland had just lost more land. In 1701, the people of Pennsylvania's lower counties asked that they be allowed to legislate and govern themselves separately from Pennsylvania, though Penn would remain their proprietor. Penn agreed, and Delaware became a de facto independent colony. A circle was drawn with a radius of 12 miles from Newcastle, and that circle became the northern border. Despite this, the Maryland governors continued to grant lands to Marylanders that Delaware felt was within its territory, but the clashes there were nothing in comparison to what was happening along the western banks of the Susquehanna River. Despite the king's edict keeping Pennsylvania's southern border at the 40th parallel, the governor of Pennsylvania in 1729 would write into existence Lancaster County, whose territory extended well into Maryland lands. In an effort to claim practical ownership, the Maryland governor urged settlement of the west banks of the Susquehanna River, which was already seeing Pennsylvania German immigration. One such Maryland settler, perhaps sent by direct order of the Maryland governor, was Thomas Cresap. Cresap established a ferry service across the river, and also, for the purpose of ridding northern Maryland of all Pennsylvania squatters and Indians, he built a blockhouse, a type of fortified colonial house whose second level extended over the first and was marked with loopholes to allow firing in all directions. Lord Baltimore, seeing Cresap as a loyal asset, officially made him a Justice of the Peace for Baltimore County. In 1723, the Lowe family, themselves Marylanders who lived near Cresap, shot 2 trespassing horses that belonged to James Patterson, a Pennsylvanian who Cresap had earlier accused of purposefully allowing his livestock to destroy Maryland fences and lands. Patterson reported the horse shootings to authorities, and Constable Charles Jones arrived with 9 men to serve a warrant to the Lowes. As they did so, however, they were attacked by Cresap and 2 others. The result of this confrontation was just 1 wounded and an ultimate victory for the Pennsylvanians, with the Lowes arrested. Cresap reported these events to Lord Baltimore as being unlawful and riotous, violent, and outrageous, adding that the entire Lowe family, including the mother, were beaten. Lord Baltimore wrote to the governor of Pennsylvania demanding the assailants be sent to Maryland for justice. After all, Baltimore reasoned, the assault had happened in Maryland territory. The governor, of course, refused, acknowledging the land dispute but also claiming the action had occurred many miles within the known bounds of Pennsylvania. For the next decade, Cresap continued to abuse the German settlers from Pennsylvania as he attempted to keep them off Maryland lands. Eventually, he sold a plot of land to an eager settler that had already belonged to Pennsylvanian John Hendricks. Cresap's defiance and poor behavior was too much, and a posse marched to Cresap's house to demand his surrender. Instead, they were greeted by 10 men eager for a fight. A melee ensued, resulting in one Pennsylvanian, Knowles Daunt, being shot in the leg. Whether the shot was a warning shot, as Cresap contended, may never be known, but Daunt was badly injured enough that his bone was seen to be protruding from his leg. The Pennsylvanians took this as a signal to retreat, but they asked Cresap's wife for a candle to aid Daunt. She refused, saying she would gladly wash her hands in Daunt's heart's blood. Daunt died of his injuries a few days later. The confrontation between Maryland and Pennsylvania was starting to look more and more like war. Cresap did nothing to ease tensions. He reported to Baltimore what had happened and then returned to his home with 20 Maryland militiamen, later joined by another 300, hoping to take by force areas of particular significance to Pennsylvania in the West Country. The group split in 2, first capturing John Hendricks, who was at the center of the previous conflict, and then capturing a Penn-loyal Quaker named Joshua Minshaw. Both men were marched to a prison in Annapolis. For the next 2 years, the two colonies took turns arresting landowners and servants found in the contested lands. Though the confrontations were apparently non-deadly, it is likely they were almost all violent to a degree. Cresap became convinced that he would soon be attacked and killed, and his paranoia led him to spend long times standing in his door, armed with pistols in his belt, a gun in his hand, and longsword by his side, like Robinson Crusoe. For years, the conflict carried on like this, with each individual household choosing its loyalty and fighting for its right to exist. In very little time, both colonies decided to change their tactic. They began making efforts to entice new settlement into their lands by people who would be loyal to them. That meant competing with each other on land prices, government support, and other policies. For the first time, settlers were able to change loyalties if it meant gaining benefits for themselves. The Maryland militia was gone and unlikely to return, but Cresap himself swore to continue the fight. He had come to be such a thorn in the side of Pennsylvania that another posse was assembled. Consisting of around 30 armed men, they marched to Cresap's blockhouse. Cresap, along with 5 men, held out for a full day before the assailants set fire to a shed near the house, forcing the inhabitants to flee. During the chaos, several men were wounded, and one of Cresap's men, Laughlin Malone, was killed, possibly in an accidental shooting by one of his comrades. For about a year after this, while Cresap languished in a Philadelphia prison, Governor Ogle of Maryland installed a deputy to the West Country, Charles Higginbotham, who put together a group of about 20 men, Irish ruffians, who worked with other prominent Marylanders in the contested region on what came to be known as the Chester County Plot, whose aim was the ousting by force of arms those German families settled on the west side of the Susquehanna. When the plot was revealed, all of those implicated either fled south or were arrested. This event marked the end of armed conflict in the Maryland-Pennsylvania border dispute. An uneasy peace replaced endless trading of arrests and beatings, and Pennsylvania continued to populate the region with Quakers and Germans. The peace was made more official when King George II, alarmed at reports of warring colonies, issued a proclamation that a temporary east-west border be established 15¼ miles south of Philadelphia. Any Marylanders still living north of this line now found themselves legally residents of Pennsylvania. A hasty surveyor's expedition was carried out jointly between the colonies, and a rough line marking the boundary was established. It wouldn't be until the 1760s, when Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon did a more detailed survey, that Maryland's current northern border would be established permanently, ending the Pennsylvania-Maryland border dispute. So how much had changed in a century? Maryland lost its holdings on the Delaware River and the Susquehanna River. It lost huge swaths of fertile land in the area that became Lower Pennsylvania. It lost almost its entire access to the Atlantic Ocean. And it had lost dozens of citizens who became overnight Pennsylvanians, not to mention those killed or jailed in Cresap's War. And throughout those same 100 years, the colony fought off insurrections, native attacks, Virginian invasions, and multiple coups. But those are stories for another video. Thanks for watching.